Joseph Whitehorse froze mid-step, his weathered combat boots suspended above the forest floor as an anguished howl pierced the Montana dawn. Not the territorial call of a wild predator, but the desperate cry of a mother watching her children face death. Through the morning mist, an impossible scene materialized. A massive Burmese python, its coils thick as telephone poles, slowly crushing the life from a silver wolf whose amber eyes blazed with maternal fury. Four tiny pups huddled beneath a fallen log 20 feet away, their plaintive whines growing weaker as they watched their mother's ribs compress with each tightening squeeze. Joe's hands trembled as he gripped his father's hunting knife, the same blade that had saved 3 Marines in Vietnam, the same steel that couldn't save his son Danny in Afghanistan 5 years ago. "Not today," he whispered, his voice cracking with 40 years of buried grief. The wolf's gaze found his across the clearing, and in those dying amber depths, Joe saw Eleanor's eyes during her final battle with Alzheimer's, the same fierce refusal to abandon those who needed her most. Time was running out, and somewhere in his shattered heart, Joe knew this moment would define what remained of his broken life. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Joseph Joe Whitehorse had always believed that some wounds never heal. They just learn to live quietly in the corners of your heart until something forces them back into the light. At 67, he carried more scars than most men twice his age. Invisible reminders of battles fought in jungles half a world away and hospital rooms that smelled of disinfectant and dying dreams. The remote Montana cabin had been his sanctuary for the past 2 years, ever since Mary's funeral. His wife of 42 years had slipped away from Alzheimer's one gray February morning, leaving behind medical bills that still arrived like clockwork, and in silence so profound it made his ears ring. The $127,000 debt sat on his kitchen table in a manila envelope, marked "Final Notice" in red letters that seemed to mock his military pension. Danny's death 5 years earlier had broken something fundamental in Joe's chest, something that Mary's gentle presence had held together with the fragile glue of shared grief. Their only son, a Marine sergeant like his father, had died protecting his unit from an IED in Afghanistan. The folded flag on Joe's mantle was the government's idea of fair exchange for 32 years of laughter, Sunday morning pancakes, and fishing trips that taught a boy how to become a man. Rex, Danny's German shepherd, had arrived with the casualty notification officer like a living piece of his son's soul. The dog understood loss in ways that transcended species, how it carved hollow spaces in your chest, how it made ordinary sounds feel too loud and ordinary silence feel too empty. Together, they had learned to navigate the geography of grief, 2 broken creatures finding comfort in shared solitude. The cabin sat on 40 acres of untouched wilderness where the Lamar Valley stretched toward Yellowstone's heart. Joe had bought the land with his combat pay in 1978, dreaming of a place where his family could breathe clean air and count stars instead of streetlights. Now it served as a retreat from a world that had taken too much and given too little in return. His days followed a simple rhythm: morning coffee on the porch where Mary used to read her novels, afternoon walks with Rex along trails that Danny had helped clear as a teenager, and evenings spent staring at photographs that captured moments when his family was whole. The foreclosure notice gave him 60 days to find a miracle, or lose the only place on earth where their ghosts still felt like company instead of haunting. Joe had been a wildlife photographer before grief redirected his focus inward. His telephoto lens now gathered dust, while his subjects, elk, bears, and the occasional wolf pack, moved through his property like living reminders of the natural world's indifference to human sorrow. He understood their survival instincts, the way they protected their young with fierce desperation, the price they paid for loving something vulnerable in a world full of predators. This morning, Like every morning for the past 733 days, Joe had awakened to the weight of accumulated loss and the stubborn, inexplicable hope that today might offer something different than yesterday's carefully managed emptiness. The python's head rose like a prehistoric nightmare, its yellow eyes cold and calculating as it registered Joe's presence. 15 feet of muscle and malice had wrapped itself around the wolf with methodical precision, each coil designed to crush ribs and collapse lungs until life simply stopped. Joe had seen death before, in rice paddies and hospital beds, but this felt different. This felt personal. "Easy, Mama," Joe whispered, circling slowly to the python's blind side. His combat training kicked in automatically, muscle memory from a war fought 50 years ago when his hands were steady and his purpose clear. The wolf's breathing had become shallow, desperate pants that reminded him of Mary's final hours when each breath was a victory against the inevitable. The hunting knife felt foreign in his arthritic fingers until he gripped it properly, the way his father had taught him to field dress deer, the way the Marine Corps had taught him to survive. One clean strike behind the skull, severing the spine before the massive body could reflexively tighten its death grip. The blade found its mark with surgical precision, and 15 feet of coiled death went limp in an instant. Luna, he would name her later, collapsed to the forest floor, her silver coat matted with blood and saliva. 3 ribs were broken, Joe could tell from the way she held her left side, and deep puncture wounds along her flank wept crimson into the pine needles. But her eyes remained fierce, tracking his movements with intelligence that seemed almost human. "You're hurt bad, girl, but your babies need you breathing," Joe murmured, opening his field kit with practiced efficiency. The same hands that had patched Marines in Vietnam now cleaned wounds with antiseptic, applied pressure bandages, and fashioned a splint from broken branches and medical tape. Luna lay perfectly still through it all, occasionally turning her massive head to check on 4 gray bundles huddled beneath the fallen log. That's when Joe noticed something that made his blood run cold. The python's belly had been surgically opened and sutured shut, crude stitches that spoke of illegal operations and unnatural purposes. Inside the cavity, partially digested remains included a collar with tags he recognized. Military-issue dog tags, the kind Danny's unit had used for their canine companions. Rex emerged from the underbrush, his ears flat against his skull and hackles raised. The German Shepherd had been tracking something, and now Joe understood what. This wasn't a random encounter with an invasive species. This was something orchestrated, something planned. Someone had brought this python here specifically, using it as a weapon or a tool. Luna struggled to her feet, testing her injured leg before limping toward her pups. The smallest one, a female with distinctive white markings on her chest, whimpered and pressed against her mother's wounded side. Joe watched the reunion with eyes that burned from more than morning smoke. Families belonged together. Children needed their mothers. Some truths transcended species. His hands shook as he examined the python's head more closely. A small tracking device had been embedded behind the skull, its LED light blinking red in a pattern he didn't recognize. Whatever this was, whoever had done this, they were still out there, still watching, still hunting. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the forest silence like a chainsaw through prayer. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows emerged from a logging road Joe hadn't known existed, their tires crunching over ground that should have been impassable to anything larger than an ATV. Rex positioned himself between Joe and the approaching threat, his lips pulled back in a snarl that promised violence. "Mr. Whitehorse," a cultured voice called out as the lead vehicle's door opened. "I see you've found our tracking device." A man in expensive outdoor gear stepped into the clearing, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the wilderness setting. Behind him, 6 others emerged carrying tranquilizer rifles and transport cages. Professional hunters, Joe realized. Men who made their living capturing things that were meant to be free. Vincent Shaw. The man introduced himself with a politician's smile that never reached his eyes. I represent certain parties with an interest in that particular wolf. She's been quite difficult to locate, but your intervention has simplified matters considerably. Joe's grip tightened on his knife, though he knew it was useless against 7 armed men. This is federal land. You have no authority here. Authority is a flexible concept, Mr. Whitehorse, especially when dealing with animals that pose a significant threat to human welfare. Vincent's gaze shifted to Luna, who had positioned herself between the approaching strangers and her vulnerable pups. That wolf has been exposed to certain pathogens. She requires immediate quarantine for public safety. The lie came so smoothly that Joe almost believed it. Almost. But he'd heard enough lies from men in suits to recognize the particular cadence of official deception. Luna wasn't sick. She was valuable. And whatever made her valuable was worth killing for. "Clock's ticking, old man," one of Vincent's companions muttered, checking his watch. "Extraction window closes in 4 hours. Joe felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, the burden of being one man against overwhelming odds. But as Luna's amber eyes met his across the clearing, he remembered something Danny had written in his final letter. "Sometimes you don't choose the fight, Dad. Sometimes the fight chooses you." "You boys are making a mistake," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violence. Rex sensed the shift in tension, his growl deepening to a rumble that vibrated through the forest floor. "This wolf isn't going anywhere with you?" Vincent's smile faltered slightly, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Mr. Whitehorse, I understand your attachment to wildlife, but you're interfering with a federal operation. That wolf has been exposed to a rare pathogen that could devastate the entire Yellowstone ecosystem if not contained immediately." The lie hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Joe had heard enough official explanations during his military career to recognize bureaucratic fiction when it wore a 3-piece suit. His eyes tracked the positioning of Vincent's men. Professionals who moved with the kind of coordinated precision that came from extensive training and expensive equipment. "Federal operation?" Joe's weathered face split into a grin that held no warmth. "Then you won't mind showing me some identification, real identification, not the kind you can buy at truck stops." Vincent's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Time is a luxury we don't have, old man. Every minute that wolf remains uncontained increases the risk of contamination spread. Do you really want to be responsible for an ecological disaster?" Luna had retreated deeper into the clearing, herding her pups toward what Joe recognized as an escape route, a narrow gap between 2 boulder formations that led to the old mining tunnels. The wolf's tactical awareness impressed him. She understood the threat, understood the odds, and was making decisions based on survival rather than pride. "Contamination," Joe repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting, considering the python you used as bait was carrying military tracking equipment. Makes a man wonder what kind of federal operation involves illegal weapons and invasive species." The forest suddenly felt smaller, the circle of armed men tightening like a noose. Joe's combat instincts cataloged details with automatic precision. 7 hostiles, tranquilizer weapons with effective range of 30 yards, 1 civilian with no body armor, extraction vehicles positioned to block primary escape routes. Classic containment formation. "Mr. Shaw," one of the gunmen interrupted, his voice tight with impatience. "The window's closing. We need to move now or abort the mission." Vincent's mask of civility slipped completely. "There is no abort option. Too much money has been invested in this project to walk away empty-handed." His cold gaze shifted to Joe. "That wolf is worth more than your mortgage debt, Whitehorse, more than your cabin, your land, your pathetic pension. She's worth enough to solve all your financial problems with money left over for a comfortable retirement." The words hit like physical blows. Joe's financial situation wasn't public knowledge. Someone had done their homework, compiled a dossier, identified pressure points and vulnerabilities. This wasn't a random encounter. He had been targeted, studied, prepared for like a military objective. "How do you know about my debt?" Joe asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Because we know everything about you, Joseph Whitehorse, Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart recipient, son killed in Afghanistan, wife dead from Alzheimer's. You're 67 years old with a failing body, crushing medical bills, and exactly 63 days before foreclosure proceedings begin." Vincent's voice carried the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "We're offering you a way out. $500,000 cash for one wolf that's going to die anyway." The offer hung between them like a loaded weapon. $500,000 would solve everything, save the cabin, pay the medical bills, provide enough left over to live comfortably for whatever years remained. All for one wolf that meant nothing to him personally, that he'd known for less than an hour. But Luna's amber eyes held his gaze with something that transcended monetary value. Trust. The same absolute trust Danny had shown when he'd asked his father to watch over Rex, to provide the loyalty and protection that military service had torn away. Some debts couldn't be paid with money. Some promises transcended financial convenience. "Rex," Joe said quietly. The German shepherd's ears perked forward, reading his master's intent with canine precision. "Go find help." The dog hesitated for exactly 1 second, the space of a heartbeat where duty warred with loyalty, then turned and vanished into the underbrush with the silent efficiency that had made him valuable to Danny's unit. Within moments, the forest had swallowed him completely. Vincent's composure cracked. "That was unwise, Mr. Whitehorse, very unwise indeed." "Maybe," Joe conceded, shifting his weight to his good leg and gripping the knife with renewed purpose. "But I learned something in Vietnam that you desk warriors never figured out. Sometimes the mission isn't about winning. Sometimes it's about buying time for someone else to get home safely." Luna had positioned her pups behind the boulder formation, out of direct line of fire. The mother wolf stood at the narrow entrance like a living barricade, her hackles raised and teeth bared in a warning that needed no translation. She was prepared to die for her children, the same way Danny had died for his Marines, the same way Mary had fought Alzheimer's until her final breath. "Last chance, Whitehorse," Vincent said, nodding to his men. "Walk away now and collect your money. Stay, and you'll be just another casualty in an unfortunate wildlife accident." Joe's grip tightened on the knife handle, his thumb finding the familiar groove worn smooth by his father's hand decades ago. Some stands couldn't be measured in tactical advantage or reasonable odds. Some fights were worth losing if the alternative meant living as a coward. "I've got a better idea," Joe said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "How about you boys pack up your toys and find someone else to bully, because this old Marine isn't moving?" The first tranquilizer dart whistled past Joe's ear, embedding itself in the pine bark with a hollow thunk that reminded him of sniper fire in the Mekong Delta. Training older than his arthritis kicked in as he dove behind the fallen log where Luna's pups had been hiding, his body moving with muscle memory that transcended the limitations of age and injury. "Take him down, but keep him breathing." Vincent's voice cut through the forest air with cold authority. "We need him conscious for questioning about the wolf's behavior patterns." Joe's mind raced as he assessed his tactical situation. 7 armed professionals with military-grade equipment versus 1 aging Marine with a hunting knife and righteous anger. The math was simple and brutal. But mathematics had never accounted for the variable of desperate determination, the wild card that turned impossible odds into the stuff of legends and casualty reports. Luna had vanished into the boulder maze with her pups, but Joe could hear her moving through the narrow passages, the soft pad of feet on stone, the occasional whimper of frightened offspring being guided to safety. She was buying him time the same way he was buying time for her. Mutual protection between species that understood the weight of sacrifice. A second dart shattered against the log inches from his head, splinters of wood stinging his cheek like tiny accusations. Joe rolled left, using the massive trunk for cover while his eyes searched for advantages in terrain that had become a battlefield. The old mining tunnels Rex had discovered last summer offered escape routes, but reaching them meant crossing 30 yards of open ground under direct fire. "Mr. Whitehorse," Vincent called out with mock patience, "you're only delaying the inevitable. We have thermal imaging, motion sensors, and enough tranquilizer drugs to drop a grizzly bear. This ends one way or another." "Yeah," Joe muttered, checking the knife's edge against his thumb. "But the story's not over yet." Movement to his right caught his attention, one of Vincent's men flanking wide through the underbrush, trying to establish a crossfire position. The gunman moved with professional competence but civilian arrogance, assuming an old man's desperation would override military training. He was wrong. Joe waited until the flanker committed to his position, then erupted from cover in a burst of speed that surprised even himself. The knife found its target between the man's shoulder blades, sliding between ribs with the precision of experience and the desperation of a father protecting something precious. The tranquilizer rifle clattered to the forest floor as its owner crumpled. "Johnson's down!" someone shouted, panic creeping into professional composure. "The old bastard's armed and dangerous." Vincent's carefully orchestrated operation was becoming a firefight, and firefights had rules that favored the desperate over the organized. Joe claimed the fallen rifle, checking its load with hands that remembered similar weapons from a different war. 6 darts remaining, effective range of 40 yards, enough stopping power to drop a charging elk. The forest erupted in a symphony of pursuit and evasion. Joe moved through terrain he'd walked for 20 years, using every depression, every fallen tree, every shadow to avoid the systematic sweep Vincent's remaining men were conducting. But age was catching up with him. His breathing was labored, his injured ankle screaming protest with each step, and the tranquilizer rifle felt heavier with each passing minute. That's when he heard it, the sound that would haunt his dreams and heal his heart in equal measure. Luna's howl echoed from somewhere deep in the tunnel system, but it wasn't a call of distress. It was a summons, a rallying cry that spoke to something primal and ancient. Within minutes, answering calls came from across the valley. Not just Luna's pack, but wolves from territories that should have been too distant to hear her voice. "What the hell was that?" one of Vincent's men asked, his voice tight with unease. "Just a wolf," Vincent replied, but uncertainty colored his tone. "Keep moving. We're running out of time." Joe reached the tunnel entrance as the first gray shapes began appearing at the forest's edge. Luna had somehow called for backup, summoning help with intelligence that defied conventional understanding of wolf behavior. The sight filled him with wonder and tactical appreciation. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The tunnels offered blessed darkness and strategic advantage. Joe knew their layout from childhood exploration and adult maintenance, but Vincent's men would be operating blind. He moved deeper into the mine shaft, using his flashlight sparingly to avoid giving away his position. Behind him, he could hear the careful advance of professional hunters who had suddenly become the hunted. "Thermal shows him about 50 meters in," a voice echoed from the tunnel entrance. "But there's interference from the rock walls. Could be equipment malfunction." It wasn't equipment malfunction. The tunnels were filled with wolves, Luna's extended family moving through passages with silent efficiency that made Navy SEALs look clumsy. Joe caught glimpses of amber eyes in his flashlight beam, intelligent faces that nodded recognition before melting back into shadows. They were coordinating, planning, executing a strategy that seemed impossible for wild animals. The sound of combat echoed from the tunnel entrance, shouts of alarm, the hiss of discharged tranquilizer weapons, the distinctive crack of rifle stocks against stone walls. Vincent's men were discovering that hunting wolves in confined spaces was different from tracking them in open terrain. Much different. Joe emerged from a side passage to find Luna waiting in a natural chamber lit by streams of sunlight from cracks in the ceiling. Her pups huddled behind her, but they were no longer cowering in fear. They watched their mother with attention that spoke of learning, of understanding that survival required more than hiding. "You brought the cavalry," Joe said softly, and Luna's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice. Danny would have appreciated the tactics. The wolf approached him slowly, deliberately, until her massive head was close enough to touch. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, they regarded each other. Two warriors who understood the price of protection, the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Luna's amber eyes held depths that reminded Joe of Mary's final, lucid moment, when his wife had looked at him with perfect clarity and whispered, "Take care of our boys." The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Vincent emerged from the tunnel mouth alone, his expensive clothes torn and his composure shattered. Blood trickled from scratches on his face and hands, evidence of close encounters with creatures that fought back. "My men are down," he said without preamble, his voice hollow with defeat. "Your wolves, they fought like soldiers. Coordinated. Intelligent. Impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Joe replied, keeping the tranquilizer rifle trained on Vincent's chest. "You just never met wolves worth dying for." Vincent's laugh held no humor. "Worth dying for? That animal is worth more than you can imagine, Whitehorse. She's carrying antibodies that could revolutionize medicine, save thousands of human lives. You're protecting something that could benefit all mankind. At what cost?" Joe's voice carried 40 years of questions about necessary sacrifices and acceptable losses. "Who decided her life was worth less than human convenience?" "The same people who decided your son's life was worth spending in Afghanistan," Vincent shot back with cruel precision. "The same people who decided your wife's suffering was worth enduring for the advancement of medical knowledge. Don't lecture me about sacrifices, soldier. You've made plenty." The words hit like physical blows, finding every scar and reopening wounds that had barely healed, but they also crystallized something that had been building in Joe's chest since the moment he'd seen Luna trapped by the python. This wasn't about one wolf or one man's grief. This was about the right to exist without being reduced to potential profit, the right to love something without having to justify its value to strangers with clipboards and bank accounts. "You're right," Joe said quietly. "I have made sacrifices. We all have. But Luna's not going to be one of them." Vincent reached slowly into his jacket, his movements careful and deliberate. "I'm sorry it has to end this way, Whitehorse. You seem like a decent man. But there's too much money involved to walk away empty-handed." The pistol that emerged from Vincent's coat was small, professional, and undoubtedly lethal. Joe's finger tightened on the tranquilizer rifle's trigger, knowing he could drop Vincent before the man could fire. But Luna was behind him, and her pups were counting on both of them to make choices that prioritized life over victory. That's when the tunnel entrance exploded with sound and fury as Rex burst through, followed by 2 park rangers and a state trooper. The German Shepherd had found help after all, leading rescue to a man who had saved his master's wolf the same way Danny had saved his squad. Vincent's gun wavered between targets before settling on Luna with fatal intent. "If I can't have her alive, Joe's tranquilizer dart caught Vincent's center mass, the impact spinning him around before he crumpled to the cave floor. The pistol discharged harmlessly into stone as its owner collapsed, adding one final echo to a confrontation that had revealed the depths people would sink to for money and the heights they would climb for love. The aftermath of violence always carried its own particular silence, the kind that settled over battlefields when the shooting stopped and survivors counted their wounds. Joe sat on the cave floor with his back against cool stone, watching as Ranger Patricia Morrison checked Vincent's pulse while her partner radioed for medical backup. The tranquilizer had done its job without permanent damage, which was more mercy than the man deserved. "You've got quite a story here, Mr. Whitehorse," State Trooper David Chen said, securing Vincent's dropped pistol in an evidence bag. "6 men with military-grade equipment, illegal tranquilizer weapons, and what appears to be an organized wildlife trafficking operation. This is going to make some very interesting paperwork." Luna had retreated to the chamber's far corner with her pups, but she watched the proceedings with alert intelligence. Her amber eyes tracked each human movement, cataloging threats and allies with the precision of a military strategist. The wolf's behavior continued to astound Joe. There was something almost supernatural about her awareness, her ability to read situations and respond with calculated purpose. Rex emerged from a side tunnel, his coat matted with dirt, but his tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. The German Shepherd had led the rescue team through 3 miles of wilderness terrain, never losing the scent trail or wavering in his determination to bring help to the man who had cared for him since Danny's death. "Good boy," Joe whispered, running his fingers through Rex's fur. "Danny would be proud of you. Both of us did our duty today." The rescue operation that followed revealed the true scope of Vincent's organization. Hidden throughout the tunnel system, investigators discovered sophisticated equipment for tracking and capturing wildlife, motion sensors, portable holding cages, and veterinary supplies that spoke of long-term planning and substantial financial backing. This wasn't the work of opportunistic poachers. This was corporate-level wildlife trafficking with international connections. "We found communication equipment linked to buyers in 6 different countries," Ranger Morrison explained as paramedics loaded Vincent onto a stretcher. "This operation was worth millions of dollars. You stumbled into something much bigger than a simple wolf capture." Vincent regained consciousness as they carried him toward the tunnel entrance, his eyes finding Joe with undimmed malice despite his restraints. "You have no idea what you've done, Whitehorse," he whispered hoarsely. "That wolf is carrying something invaluable." "Something that could save lives." "Maybe," Joe replied, watching Luna guide her pups deeper into the cave system. "But some things aren't for sale, no matter how much they're worth." The investigation that followed would expose a trafficking network stretching from Yellowstone to black markets in Asia and Europe, where exotic animals commanded prices that made human trafficking look economically modest. Vincent Shaw, as investigators discovered, was merely a middle manager in an organization that treated wildlife as inventory and wilderness as a free-range warehouse. But for Joe, the real revelation came 3 hours later when veterinarian Dr. Sarah Blackfeet arrived to examine Luna's injuries. The young woman worked with gentle competence, checking the wolf's wounds while speaking in soothing tones that seemed to calm both mother and pups. "She's remarkable," Dr. Blackfeet said, cleaning the puncture wounds with practiced efficiency. "Her bone density is unusual for a wild wolf, and her muscle development suggests either extraordinary genetics or some kind of conditioning program. Has she ever been in captivity?" Joe watched Luna submit to the medical examination with patient cooperation that defied every wildlife manual ever written. Wild wolves didn't behave this way around humans. They didn't demonstrate tactical intelligence or coordinate pack responses across territorial boundaries. They didn't form instant bonds with aging Marines who reminded them of someone they'd lost. "Doctor," Joe said carefully, "what would make a wolf behave like Luna? The intelligence, the trust, the way she seemed to understand military tactics." Dr. Blackfeet paused in her examination, her hands stilling on Luna's flank. "There are stories," she said slowly, "about military working dogs and their handlers developing bonds that transcend normal animal-human relationships. Deep psychological connections formed under extreme stress. If a wolf had been exposed to that kind of intensive training and bonding..." The words hung in the cave air like incense, heavy with implication. Joe's mind raced through possibilities that bordered on the impossible. Danny's unit had worked with military dogs in Afghanistan. Danny had written about forming connections with animals that understood warfare better than most humans. Danny had died protecting both his human squad and their four-legged companions. "There's something else," Dr. Blackfeet continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Luna's pregnant. Early stages, maybe 6 weeks. She's carrying a second litter." The news hit Joe like artillery fire. Luna wasn't just protecting existing offspring, she was carrying the future of her bloodline. The stakes had just doubled, and suddenly Vincent's desperate pursuit made even more sense. One pregnant wolf could potentially establish an entire breeding program for whatever made Luna special. As if sensing the gravity of the revelation, Luna approached Joe with deliberate purpose. She moved slowly, carefully, until she was close enough to place her massive paw on his boot, the same gesture she'd made after he'd saved her from the python. But this time, she held his gaze and tilted her head in a way that reminded him so powerfully of Danny that his breath caught in his throat. "Danny," Joe whispered, the name escaping like a prayer. "She reminds me of Danny." Dr. Blackfeet looked up from her equipment, her dark eyes filled with sudden understanding. "What was your son's name, Mr. Whitehorse?" "Daniel Whitehorse, Marine Sergeant, killed in Afghanistan 5 years ago." The words still tasted like copper and grief, but saying them felt less like self-torture and more like honoring memory. "Sergeant Whitehorse worked with the K-9 units, didn't he?" "Doctor." Blackfeet's voice carried a gentleness that suggested she already knew the answer. There were stories about his work with wolves captured near the base, rehabilitation programs that weren't officially documented. The pieces of an impossible puzzle began clicking together in Joe's mind. Danny's letters had mentioned working with special projects that he couldn't discuss in detail due to security classifications, animals that had been injured by combat operations and required extensive care, bonds formed between soldiers and creatures that understood loss, trauma, and the weight of protecting something precious. "She knows me," Joe said with sudden certainty. "Luna knows me because Danny told her about me." Rex had positioned himself beside Luna, the German shepherd, and the wolf standing together like veterans of the same war. Two animals that had lost their primary humans but found purpose in protecting what remained of their chosen families. The sight filled Joe with an emotion too complex for tears. Part grief, part wonder, part recognition of connections that transcended death. State Trooper Chen returned from the tunnel entrance carrying a sealed evidence bag that contained something Joe didn't immediately recognize. "We found this in one of Vincent's vehicles," he said, holding up what appeared to be a leather collar with military-style tags. "Looks like it might belong to your wolf." Joe's hands trembled as he examined the collar through the plastic. The tags bore familiar markings, Danny's unit designation, deployment dates, and something else that made his heart stop completely. Engraved in small letters beneath the official information were the words Luna, D, Whitehorse, family. The proof was undeniable. Luna wasn't just any wolf that had wandered into his life by chance. She was Danny's wolf, a living piece of his son's service and sacrifice. Vincent hadn't been hunting random wildlife. He'd been pursuing a specific animal with documented military connections and trained capabilities that made her invaluable to the right buyers. "How is this possible?" Joe asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "How did she find me?" Dr. Blackfeet finished her examination and sat back on her heels, her expression thoughtful. Animals form emotional maps based on scent, sound, and behavioral patterns. If Luna bonded with your son, she would have learned to recognize everything associated with him, including family members he talked about, showed pictures of, or corresponded with. Wolves can track emotional connections across incredible distances. The implications were staggering. Luna hadn't stumbled into the python trap by accident. She'd been searching for something or someone connected to Danny. She'd found her way to Joe because some part of her understood that families belonged together, that love created obligations that survived even death. As evening shadows began creeping across the cave floor, Joe made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. He was going to take Luna home, not just to provide sanctuary for a remarkable animal, but to honor his son's trust and complete a mission that had begun in an Afghan desert 5 years ago. The bureaucratic complications would be enormous: federal regulations about wildlife possession, veterinary requirements, insurance liabilities, and a dozen other legal obstacles that threatened to transform rescue into imprisonment. But Joe had navigated bureaucracy before, and he had allies now. Rangers who'd witnessed Vincent's operation, veterinarians who understood Luna's unique circumstances, and a story that would resonate with anyone who'd ever lost someone they loved. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Vincent's arrest, shattering the fragile peace Joe had built around his new reality with Luna and her growing family. Rex's warning growl from the porch preceded the electronic intrusion by exactly 4 seconds. Enough time for Joe to grab the .45 from his nightstand and position himself where he could see both the front door and the forest beyond. "Mr. Whitehorse?" The voice belonged to Dr. Blackfeet, but her professional composure had cracked into something raw and desperate. "You need to get to the clinic immediately. Luna's in labor and there are complications." The drive through midnight darkness became a blur of gravel roads and pine trees illuminated by headlights that seemed inadequate against the weight of impending catastrophe. Joe's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity while his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. Luna had been healthy at her last checkup, her pregnancy progressing normally despite the trauma she'd endured, but nature had its own schedule for heartbreak, and Joe had learned not to trust promises of happy endings. The veterinary clinic sat like an island of harsh fluorescent light in an ocean of Montana darkness. Joe burst through the front door to find Dr. Blackfeet waiting with an expression that prepared him for news he didn't want to hear. Behind her, muffled sounds of distress echoed from the examination room, not Luna's voice, but something smaller, more fragile. "She delivered 4 pups," Dr. Blackfeet said without preamble. "3 are healthy, but the 4th—" Her voice trailed off as she led him toward the back room where Luna lay on a specially constructed birthing table that accommodated her size while providing medical access. Luna looked smaller than Joe remembered, diminished by exhaustion and blood loss that painted her silver coat with darker stains. Her amber eyes found his immediately, carrying a message that transcended species barriers: pain, fear, a mother's desperate need for someone she trusted to understand what words couldn't express. The surviving pups nursed with vigor that spoke of strong constitutions and promising futures. But in the corner of the room, wrapped in a small blanket, lay the 4th member of their family. A tiny male whose coloring would have matched Luna's perfectly if his chest had continued rising and falling with the rhythm of life. "Stillborn," Dr. Blackfeet explained gently. "It happens sometimes with wild wolves, especially those who've experienced significant trauma. Luna did everything right. but his heart never started beating. Joe approached the small bundle with steps that felt like walking through quicksand. The pup looked perfect, ears folded, eyes sealed, tiny paws that would never learn to hunt or play or protect the pack. Death had claimed him before life had offered its first lesson, leaving behind the particular emptiness that comes from mourning potential rather than memory. Luna's soft whimper drew his attention back to the mother who had already lost so much. Her mate to illegal hunters, her freedom to Vincent's greed, and now a child to the cruel mathematics of biology. Joe knelt beside the table and placed his weathered hand on her head, feeling the tremor of grief that ran through her exhausted body. "I know, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with shared sorrow. "I know how it feels to lose part of your family before you're ready to let them go." The next 3 hours passed in a haze of veterinary procedures and quiet vigil. Luna required surgery to address complications from the birth, leaving Joe to watch over 3 newborns who depended on their mother's survival for their own continued existence. He found himself thinking about Danny's letters from Afghanistan, descriptions of caring for wounded animals while mortar shells fell in the distance. Life persisted in the margins of violence, but it required human intervention to bridge the gap between vulnerability and strength. Rex had claimed sentry duty outside the clinic, his German Shepherd instincts recognizing the importance of protecting the new pack members. Through the windows, Joe could see his dog pacing methodical patterns around the building's perimeter, alert for threats that might emerge from darkness while his human family faced crisis behind sterile walls. Dr. Blackfeet emerged from surgery at dawn, her scrubs stained with evidence of work that measured success in heartbeats and millimeters of healing tissue. "She's stable," she announced, fatigue making her voice hoarse. "The surgery went well, but she'll need several weeks of recovery before she can properly care for the pups." "What does that mean?" Joe asked, though part of him already understood the implications. "It means you're about to become a foster father to 3 wolf pups who will need feeding every 2 hours, temperature regulation, and socialization that prepares them for eventual return to the wild." Dr. Blackfeet's expression combined professional concern with something that might have been amusement. "Think you're up for that kind of responsibility at your age?" Joe looked at the 3 gray bundles sleeping peacefully in their makeshift den, oblivious to the drama that had preceded their entrance into the world. They would grow into apex predators capable of bringing down elk and defending territory against any threat. But right now, they were as helpless as human babies, dependent on warmth and milk and the kind of patient attention that required sacrificing sleep for months. "Danny would have loved this," Joe said, surprising himself with the observation. He always talked about wanting kids someday, teaching them about the woods and animals and what it means to protect something smaller than yourself. The irony wasn't lost on him. At 67, facing foreclosure and drowning in medical debt, he was about to take on responsibilities that would have challenged a man half his age with twice his resources. But as Luna's eyes opened and tracked his movement across the room, Joe felt something shift in his chest, a sense of purpose that had been missing since Mary's funeral, a reason to wake up that extended beyond personal survival. The bureaucratic nightmare began immediately. Federal wildlife officials arrived within hours, armed with regulations and forms that threatened to transform rescue into legal imprisonment. Luna's status as a wolf with military connections complicated every standard procedure, creating precedents that required consultation with agencies spanning from the Department of Agriculture to the Pentagon. "We understand your attachment to the animal," Special Agent Martinez explained with bureaucratic sympathy, "but private citizens can't simply adopt wolves, regardless of emotional circumstances. There are protocols, facilities specifically designed for this kind of situation." Joe listened to explanations about proper wildlife management and the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals, while Luna watched from her recovery cage with eyes that held intelligence no regulation could classify. The officials spoke about Luna as if she were inventory to be processed rather than a sentient being who had chosen trust over flight, cooperation over instinct. "What if she chooses to stay?" Joe asked during a particularly heated discussion about relocation options. "What if Luna decides that my property provides better protection for her pups than any government facility?" The question created uncomfortable silence among officials who dealt in policy rather than possibility. Wildlife regulations assumed animals would choose wilderness over human contact, that natural instincts would override learned behavior and emotional bonds. But Luna's case defied assumptions, creating legal gray areas that had never been tested in court. Dr. Blackfeet provided the solution that bridged bureaucracy and common sense. "What if we established Mr. Whitehorse's property as a temporary wildlife rehabilitation facility?" she suggested. "Luna could recover there under veterinary supervision while we monitor her reintegration with wild behavior patterns. If she chooses to leave after the pups are weaned, we facilitate that transition. If she chooses to stay, we reassess her status based on demonstrated preference." The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it provided legal framework for what everyone secretly hoped would happen. Joe would become Luna's guardian while she recovered, caring for 3 wolf pups who would grow up straddling the boundary between wild and domesticated, learning lessons about survival from both human kindness and lupine instinct. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning when autumn frost painted the cabin windows with crystalline warnings of winter's approach. Joe recognized the handwriting immediately, careful block letters that belonged to someone accustomed to writing under difficult conditions, someone who understood that words might be the last gift they could give to the people they loved. Dr. Blackfeet had found the letter sealed in an evidence bag among Vincent's confiscated materials, overlooked during the initial investigation, but discovered during the detailed inventory of his operation. The envelope bore Danny's name in Vincent's handwriting, suggesting a connection that predated the Python incident by years. "I thought you should read this privately," Dr. Blackfeet had said when she delivered it, her expression carrying the weight of someone who understood how the past could ambush the present without warning. "Vincent had this in a safe deposit box with Luna's veterinary records and training documentation. Whatever your son was involved in, it was bigger than any of us realized." Joe's hands trembled as he broke the seal, releasing Danny's voice from 5 years of silence. "Dad, if you're reading this, something went wrong with the mission and Vincent kept his promise to find you. Luna should be with you now, along with whatever family she's managed to build since I've been gone. I hope she found you the way Rex found me, when you needed each other most. I can't tell you everything about the work we've been doing here, but I can tell you about Luna. She was captured after her pack was killed by an IED blast near our forward operating base. Civilian contractors had been using wolves for illegal hunting expeditions, and when the explosion started, her family paid the price for human stupidity. We found her 3 days later, wounded and protecting 2 pups that didn't survive their injuries. The base veterinarian wanted to euthanize her, said she was too traumatized to ever trust humans again. But something about her reminded me of the stories you used to tell about wounded soldiers who just needed someone to believe they could heal. So I volunteered to work with her, against direct orders and probably against common sense. Spent 6 months earning her trust, teaching her that not all humans were enemies, that some of us understood what it meant to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. Luna learned faster than any animal I've ever seen. Not just basic commands, but tactical thinking, problem-solving, emotional reading that went beyond normal canine intelligence. She started protecting the other working dogs, organizing defensive positions during mortar attacks, even alerting us to IED locations before our equipment could detect them. Vincent Shaw ran the program that was studying Luna's capabilities. He's not a bad man, Dad. Just someone who lost his family to violence and can't accept that some tragedies don't have solutions. His granddaughter, Emma, has a rare genetic condition that's killing her slowly, and he's convinced Luna's blood chemistry holds answers that could save her life. The thing is, he might be right. Luna survived injuries that should have killed her, adapted to stress that broke other animals, developed cognitive abilities that border on supernatural. If her genetics could help sick children, wouldn't we be obligated to try? But here's what Vincent doesn't understand. Luna's remarkable abilities aren't because of what's in her blood. They're because of what's in her heart. Love, loyalty. The same things that made you fight for Mom during her sickness, the same things that make soldiers sacrifice themselves for strangers they'll never meet. You can't extract love from tissue samples or replicate loyalty in laboratory conditions. Luna's gifts come from choosing to trust despite having every reason to hate, from deciding that family means more than survival. I'm sending her to you because I won't be coming home. Not from this deployment, maybe not ever. The mission we're planning has low survival odds, but it might save the village where Emma's family lived before the war scattered them across refugee camps. Sometimes the math works out that one life can protect dozens of others, and when that equation presents itself, Marines don't get to choose the easy answer. Take care of Luna, Dad. Let her teach you what she taught me about healing from wounds that never stop bleeding. She understands grief better than most humans, and she knows that love doesn't end just because breathing stops. I know you blame yourself for not being able to save Mom's mind from the Alzheimer's, for not being able to fix the things that were breaking our family apart. But Luna will show you that some rescues happen slowly, that healing occurs in daily choices to keep caring for something vulnerable even when the future seems impossible. There's money hidden in the cabin, behind Mom's favorite bookshelf inside the hollowed-out copy of Old Yeller that made you cry when you read it to me as a kid. Vincent helped me transfer my combat pay and life insurance into an account that can't be touched by government agencies or medical bill collectors, enough to keep the cabin, pay off the debt, and provide for Luna's care. Don't feel guilty about accepting it. You earned this money every day you worried about me. Every night you stayed awake listening for phone calls that might bring bad news. Parents serve their country too, Dad. They just don't get medals for the courage it takes to love someone in a dangerous profession. By the time you read this, Luna will have made her choice about staying or leaving. She's not a pet, and she's not a wild animal. She's something new. A bridge between human and lupine understanding that exists because love created possibilities that didn't exist before. If she chooses to stay, honor that choice. If she chooses to leave, honor that too. But either way, trust that she's teaching you the same lesson she taught me. Family isn't limited by species or genetics or conventional definitions. Family is created by conscious decisions to protect, nurture, and sacrifice for the welfare of others. Take care of yourself, Dad. Mom is waiting somewhere beyond the pain, and I'll be there too when your tour of duty is finally complete. Until then, Luna will stand guard over the parts of your heart that still know how to hope. Your son, Danny P.S. The smallest pup always tries to sleep on your feet. Let him. He's guarding your dreams the same way you guarded mine. Joe read the letter 3 times before the words stopped blurring through tears that felt like decades of accumulated grief finally finding expression. Danny had known he wasn't coming home, had planned for contingencies that included his father's financial ruin and emotional collapse. Even facing his own death, Danny had prioritized protecting the people and animals he loved. Luna appeared on the porch as if summoned by his emotional distress, her amber eyes reflecting understanding that transcended species barriers. Behind her, 3 healthy pups tumbled through the autumn leaves, their playful energy a testament to Luna's successful recovery and maternal dedication. The smallest one, just as Danny had predicted, immediately claimed Joe's boots as the perfect place for an afternoon nap. The hidden money proved to be real, enough to transform crushing debt into financial security, to convert the cabin from a burden into a sanctuary. But more importantly, Danny's letter provided answers to questions that had haunted Joe since Luna first looked at him with recognition that seemed impossible for a wild animal. Dr. Blackfeet arrived that evening to find Joe sitting on the porch with Luna beside him, watching her pups explore their expanding world with curiosity tempered by caution. "You found something in the letter," she observed, settling into Mary's old rocking chair without invitation. "I found my son," Joe replied, his voice steady for the first time in years. "And I found out why Luna chose to trust a broken-down Marine who didn't think he had anything left to offer." They sat in comfortable silence as twilight painted the forest in shades of gold and purple. Luna's pups had grown large enough to demonstrate distinct personalities, the largest male showing leadership tendencies, the female displaying problem-solving skills that reminded Joe of her mother, and the smallest male proving that size didn't determine courage when it came to protecting the pack. "Vincent Shaw's trial starts next month," Dr. Blackfeet said eventually. "His lawyers are claiming emotional disturbance due to his granddaughter's condition. They want to use Luna's blood work as evidence that his research could have saved lives." Joe considered this information while watching Luna train her pups in hunting techniques using toys Rex had donated from Danny's old room. "Maybe Vincent was right about Luna's genetics being special," he said slowly. "But he was wrong about the source of that specialness." "How so?" "Love creates genetic changes over generations. Loyalty, courage, intelligence. Those traits get passed down when they're consistently rewarded and nurtured. Luna's abilities aren't accidents of biology. They're the result of generations of wolves who chose cooperation over competition, who survived by caring for their pack members rather than just themselves." The implications were staggering. If Luna's remarkable capabilities could be understood and encouraged rather than extracted and replicated, if her offspring could be raised to develop similar traits through positive reinforcement and emotional bonding, then Vincent's dream of helping sick children might be achievable without sacrificing the animals that made it possible. "There's something else," Dr. Blackfeet said, her voice carrying the weight of professionally difficult news. "Emma Shaw, Vincent's granddaughter, has been asking to meet Luna. Her condition has stabilized somewhat, and she's been following news about the rescue operation. She wants to thank the wolf that her grandfather was trying to save her through." Joe looked at Luna, who had paused in her teaching to listen to their conversation with the focused attention that continued to amaze him. The wolf's intelligence allowed her to understand human speech patterns, to recognize when discussions concerned her welfare and the welfare of her family. "What do you think, girl?" Joe asked softly. "Ready to meet the little human your genetics might help save?" Luna's response came in the form of a gentle nuzzle against his hand, followed by a soft chuff that sounded remarkably like agreement. Her pups gathered around her as if sensing the importance of the moment, their amber eyes reflecting the same intelligence that had made their mother remarkable. The healing was beginning to work both ways. Luna recovering from trauma through human kindness, Joe recovering from grief through lupine wisdom about the nature of family and the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The meeting between Luna and Emma Shaw took place on a crisp October morning when the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue and the aspens wore their autumn gold like ceremonial robes. Joe had spent 3 days preparing the cabin grounds, creating a neutral space where a 6-year-old girl could safely encounter a wolf who carried both her grandfather's desperate hopes and her father's military legacy. Emma arrived with her father, Samuel Shaw, Vincent's son who had opposed his father's illegal methods while supporting his grandfather's love for his dying child. The little girl emerged from the car like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, her bald head covered by a bright red knit cap that couldn't hide the profound intelligence in her dark eyes. Despite the ravages of her condition, Emma moved with determination that reminded Joe powerfully of Danny at the same age, stubborn, curious, and utterly fearless in the face of things that should have frightened her. "Is that her?" Emma whispered, her voice carrying awe rather than fear as Luna emerged from the forest with her 3 pups trailing behind like faithful shadows. "Is that the wolf Grandpa Vincent was trying to save me through?" Luna approached slowly, deliberately, her amber eyes fixed on the small human who represented both threat and possibility. The wolf had learned to read human intentions with supernatural accuracy, and whatever she sensed in Emma caused her hackles to relax and her tail to shift from neutral to cautiously welcoming. "She's beautiful," Emma breathed, sinking to her knees in the grass without concern for her expensive clothes or her father's worried protests. "She looks like the wolves in my dreams." Joe watched the interaction with held breath, remembering Danny's warnings about Luna's ability to sense human emotions and respond to unspoken needs. The wolf circled Emma at a respectful distance, nostrils flaring as she cataloged scents that told stories about illness, medication, and the particular sadness that clung to children who understood mortality before they understood algebra. Emma's father, Samuel, stood rigid with protective tension. "Emma, remember what we discussed about wild animals? No sudden movements, no loud noises, and absolutely no trying to touch her without permission." But Emma had already extended her hand palm up in a gesture that somehow conveyed both respect and invitation. Luna paused her circling, tilted her massive head, and stepped forward to sniff the offered fingers. The wolf's touch was gentle, deliberate, like a doctor taking a pulse or a priest offering benediction. "She smells like medicine," Emma said matter-of-factly, "but also like love, like someone who takes care of babies who can't take care of themselves." The observation hit Joe like artillery fire. This child, facing her own mortality with 6-year-old courage, had identified the essential truth about Luna's nature in 30 seconds, something that had taken him weeks to understand and Vincent years to misinterpret. Luna's pups had been watching the interaction with typical juvenile caution, but Emma's calm acceptance of their mother seemed to give them permission to investigate. The smallest male, true to Danny's prediction, approached Emma's boots with the same confidence he showed when claiming Joe's feet as sleeping territory. "Oh!" Emma laughed, the sound pure joy unmarked by the weight of medical appointments and treatment protocols. "He likes my shoes. They're new. Daddy bought them specially for meeting you because my old ones had hospital smell." Samuel Shaw's expression shifted from protective fear to wondering amazement as his daughter interacted with a family of wolves as naturally as other children played with puppies. "Emma, how do you know what to do?" "We never taught you about wolves." "The dreams," Emma said simply, scratching behind the small pup's ears with instinctive accuracy. "Ever since Grandpa Vincent started telling me about the special wolf, I've been dreaming about running through forests with a pack. Not scary dreams, happy dreams where I could breathe without machines and run without getting tired." Joe felt something cold settle in his stomach. Emma's dreams sounded remarkably similar to experiences Danny had described in his letters. Visions of running with Luna through Afghan mountains, dreams where human and wolf consciousness seemed to merge in ways that defied biological explanation. Dr. Blackfeet, who had been documenting the interaction for her research, looked up from her notes with expression that bordered on clinical amazement. "Emma, in your dreams, do you see things from the wolf's perspective? Do you experience the world through her senses?" "Sometimes," Emma nodded, never taking her attention away from Luna's pups. I can smell things humans can't smell, hear sounds that are too quiet for regular ears, and I can feel what the pack feels: love, protection, sadness when someone gets lost. The implications were staggering. If Emma was somehow psychologically connected to Luna's experiences, if her dreams represented genuine emotional resonance rather than childhood fantasy, then Vincent's obsession with his granddaughter's genetics might have missed the real source of potential healing. Luna had positioned herself where she could monitor both Emma's interaction with her pups and the adult humans who watched with varying degrees of wonder and concern. The wolf's intelligence had always impressed Joe, but seeing her assess a complex social situation involving multiple species while managing 3 energetic offspring elevated his respect for her capabilities to new levels. "Mr. Whitehorse," Samuel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "Emma has been talking about wolves constantly since Vincent's arrest, not from fear or trauma, but from longing. She asks about Luna's health, worries about whether the pups are learning to hunt properly, dreams about running with them through forests she's never seen." Joe watched Emma demonstrate an almost supernatural understanding of lupine body language, adjusting her posture and vocal tones to communicate with Luna's family in ways that suggested intuitive knowledge rather than learned behavior. The child was dying, but in this moment, surrounded by wolves who accepted her as pack, she seemed more alive than most healthy adults. "There's something else," Samuel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Since Vincent told her about Luna, Emma's condition has stabilized. Not improved dramatically, but stopped deteriorating. Her doctors can't explain it medically." "Doctor." Blackfeet set down her clipboard entirely, her scientific objectivity challenged by observations that defied conventional understanding. "Have you considered that Emma's connection to Luna might be therapeutic in ways we don't yet understand? That emotional bonding across species might trigger healing responses that purely medical interventions can't achieve?" The conversation was interrupted by Emma's delighted laughter as Luna's largest pup decided to test the new human's playfulness by bringing her a stick for potential games. Emma accepted the offering with the solemnity of someone receiving a diplomatic gift, then threw it with surprising strength for someone fighting a terminal illness. "She's teaching them that humans can be fun," Emma explained to the amazed adults. "Most wolves think humans are dangerous or boring, but I'm showing them we can play too." Joe felt tears threatening as he watched a dying child teach wolf pups about joy, teaching them lessons about trust and cooperation that might shape their interactions with humans for their entire lives. Emma was creating positive associations that could influence wolf behavior for generations, building bridges between species through simple acts of kindness and understanding. Luna approached Joe directly, her amber eyes holding a message that transcended language barriers. The wolf had made her decision about Emma Shaw, and that decision involved acceptance, protection, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "I think," Joe said slowly, his voice rough with emotion, "Luna wants Emma to visit again, regularly, as often as her health allows." Samuel Shaw's eyes filled with tears that spoke of parents' desperate gratitude. Would that be possible? "Emma's treatments require her to stay close to the hospital, but weekends might work, if Luna wouldn't mind." Luna's response came in the form of a gentle nuzzle against Emma's shoulder, followed by a soft whoof that sounded remarkably like agreement. The wolf had chosen to adopt another family member, expanding her pack to include a small human who understood loss, courage, and the fierce determination to protect those who needed protection. The healing, Joe realized, was working in directions none of them had anticipated. Emma was finding strength through her connection to Luna's wild courage, while Luna was learning that human family could extend beyond military bonds to include civilian love that was equally profound and equally worthy of sacrifice. 6 months later, Joe stood on his porch watching Emma Shaw chase Luna's pups through the autumn meadow behind his cabin, her laughter echoing across the valley like a church bell calling the faithful to witness miracles. The little girl who had arrived in a wheelchair now ran with the boundless energy of childhood restored, her remission defying every medical prediction and transforming her grandfather Vincent's desperation into wonder. The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. Healing rarely was. Instead, it had come in small increments measured in improved appetite, deeper sleep, and blood work that consistently surprised her oncology team. Dr. Martinez, Emma's primary physician, had finally admitted that her patient's connection to Luna's pack was producing therapeutic benefits that conventional medicine couldn't explain or replicate. "It's not magic," Dr. Martinez had told Emma's father during their last appointment. "But it's something we don't have names for yet." The psychological benefits of interspecial bonding, the stress reduction from regular contact with animals who provide unconditional acceptance, these factors create physiological changes that support healing in ways we're only beginning to understand. Emma visited every weekend now, arriving Friday afternoon and staying until Sunday evening in a routine that had become sacred to both human and lupine participants. Luna's pups, now adolescent wolves with distinct personalities and impressive size, had learned to anticipate Emma's arrival with excitement that bordered on religious fervor. They had never known a world where humans were enemies, only sources of play, protection, and the kind of love that transcended species boundaries. The largest male pup, whom Emma had named Guardian, had appointed himself her personal protector during their adventures. The female, christened Sage for her problem-solving abilities, had learned to open doors, operate simple latches, and communicate complex needs through combinations of gestures and vocalizations that suggested intelligence bordering on supernatural. The smallest male, Forever, Emma's name choice that made Joe's eyes water every time he heard it, continued his tradition of sleeping on feet, though he now divided his attention between Joe's boots and Emma's sneakers. Vincent Shaw had been released from federal prison after serving 18 months, his sentence reduced due to his cooperation with investigators dismantling the international wildlife trafficking network he had inadvertently exposed. The man who emerged from incarceration bore little resemblance to the desperate grandfather who had orchestrated Luna's capture. Prison had taught him humility, and Emma's recovery had taught him that love sometimes achieved what desperation could not. "I was so focused on saving her life that I forgot to let her live," Vincent had confessed during his first visit to Joe's cabin since his release. Luna saved Emma by being herself, wild, free, loving without conditions. I tried to cage that spirit and extract its essence when all I needed to do was let Emma experience it directly. The old man now worked as a volunteer at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center that had been established on Joe's property, using his veterinary knowledge to help injured animals while learning patience from creatures who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. His relationship with his son Samuel had been slowly rebuilt through shared commitment to Emma's continued recovery and their mutual respect for the wolves, who had accomplished what medical intervention alone could not. Joe's own transformation had been equally profound, though less visible to outside observers. The crushing debt that had threatened to steal his home had been eliminated by Danny's hidden funds, but more importantly, the crushing grief that had threatened to steal his purpose had been transformed into something resembling peace. Luna had taught him that love didn't end with death. It evolved into new forms of caring, new opportunities to protect and nurture life in all its vulnerable manifestations. Rex had adapted to his expanded pack role with German Shepherd efficiency, serving as both translator between human and lupine communication styles and mediator when Emma's enthusiasm occasionally overwhelmed lupine patients. The old military dog had found renewed purpose in training Luna's offspring, teaching them commands that might someday save their lives if they encountered other humans less understanding than their chosen family. The bureaucratic challenges of maintaining a wolf pack on private property had been navigated through a combination of Dr. Blackfeet's research documentation, Emma's medical team's therapeutic recommendations, and Vincent's legal testimony about Luna's unique history and capabilities. Joe's property now held official status as a wildlife research facility, generating modest income through educational programs that allowed other families to experience supervised interactions with socialized wolves. "The applications keep coming," Dr. Blackfeet reported during one of her weekly visits to document Luna's pack dynamics. Families with children facing terminal illnesses, veterans struggling with PTSD, elderly individuals dealing with depression and isolation, word is spreading about what's happening here. Joe considered the implications while watching Emma teach Forever how to fetch sticks without destroying them in his enthusiasm. What had begun as one man rescuing one wolf had evolved into something larger, a bridge between human and animal healing that suggested new possibilities for therapeutic intervention. "We'll need to be careful," Joe said thoughtfully. "Luna chose to trust us, but that doesn't mean every wolf will make the same choice, and not every human is ready to understand that healing sometimes requires surrendering control rather than asserting it." Emma's voice carried across the meadow as she called her lupin friends to gather for their afternoon training session. The girl had developed her own methods for working with Luna's offspring, combining techniques learned from professional animal trainers with intuitive understanding that seemed to emerge from her dreams about running with wild packs. "Guardian, Sage, Forever, come learn something new." Emma's command brought 3 nearly full-grown wolves bounding across the grass with the eagerness of puppies responding to their favorite human. They had learned their names, learned complex commands, learned to distinguish between play behavior and serious communication in ways that continued to amaze visiting researchers. Luna watched her offspring's training with the pride of a mother whose children had exceeded every expectation. The alpha female had never lost her wild instincts, but she had expanded her definition of pack to include humans who had proven their loyalty through consistent actions rather than words. Her amber eyes tracked every interaction between Emma and her pups, ready to intervene if play became too rough or human enthusiasm exceeded lupine tolerance. "Mr. Whitehorse," Emma called, waving him over to witness Guardian's latest accomplishment. "Come see what he learned. He can open gates now, but only when I ask him to. He won't do it for strangers." Joe approached the demonstration with mixture of pride and concern. Guardian's intelligence was remarkable, but wolves who could manipulate human-designed barriers posed potential problems if they ever decided to leave the safety of his property. The balance between nurturing their natural abilities and maintaining appropriate boundaries required constant vigilance. Guardian performed his gate-opening demonstration with theatrical flair, clearly enjoying the attention his skills generated. But more importantly, he stopped immediately when Emma gave the command to halt, demonstrating the kind of impulse control that suggested these wolves were developing capabilities that went beyond normal pack behavior. "Emma," Joe said gently, "what do you think Guardian would do if a stranger asked him to open that gate?" "He'd look at Luna first," Emma replied without hesitation. "Then he'd look at you or Rex. He only takes important commands from pack members, and he knows the difference between pack and visitors." The sophisticated social understanding Emma described suggested that Luna's offspring were developing complex protocols for human interaction, recognizing hierarchy, distinguishing between trusted and unknown individuals, and maintaining loyalty to their chosen family while remaining appropriately cautious with strangers. As evening approached, Emma's father arrived to collect his daughter for the return trip to town. The farewell ritual had become as structured as the weekend's activities, each wolf receiving individual attention and specific goodbye gestures that Emma had developed through months of observation and intuition. "See you next weekend," Emma whispered to Forever as the smallest wolf claimed his traditional position across her feet. "Keep practicing the new tricks, but don't teach them to anyone else until I get back." Forever's response was a soft woof that sounded remarkably like agreement, followed by a gentle nuzzle that conveyed affection transcending species boundaries. The bond between the dying child and the wolf pup had become something precious beyond medical explanation, a connection that suggested healing might be as much about emotional resonance as physical intervention. Joe walked Emma and her father to their car, Luna's entire pack following in loose formation that provided escort without appearing threatening. The wolves had learned to recognize departure rituals and respond with behavior that offered comfort rather than distress, understanding somehow that goodbyes were temporary rather than permanent. "Mr. Whitehorse," Samuel Shaw said as he helped Emma into her car seat, "I can never adequately thank you for what you've given our family. Emma talks about you and Luna constantly during the week. You've become her heroes." "Emma's the hero," Joe replied, watching the little girl wave goodbye to wolves who had learned to wave back by lifting their paws in response. "She taught us that healing works both ways, that love creates possibilities we never imagined." As the car disappeared down the gravel drive, Joe stood with Luna's pack in the gathering twilight, feeling more complete than he had since Danny's death. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of a family that transcended conventional definitions. Human and wolf, young and old, wild and domesticated, all united by bonds forged through shared vulnerability and mutual protection. Luna approached him as darkness settled over the Montana landscape, her amber eyes reflecting starlight and wisdom accumulated through experiences that had transformed trauma into strength. She placed her massive paw on his boot in the gesture that had become their private communication, conveying trust, gratitude, and the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to care for those who needed caring. "Thank you, girl," Joe whispered, his voice carrying words meant for Luna, for Danny, for Mary, for everyone who had taught him that love created obligations that survived even death. "Thank you for teaching an old Marine that some missions never end. They just evolve into new forms of service." The howl that rose from Luna's throat carried across the valley like a benediction, calling to wild cousins who understood that pack meant family, that family meant forever, and that forever began with the simple decision to protect something smaller and more vulnerable than yourself. For our listeners aged 55 to 68, like Joe, many of us have reached a stage where life has taken more than it's given. Lost spouses, children who've moved away, bodies that don't work like they used to, and bank accounts that never seem sufficient. But Joe's story reminds us that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten. At 67, he discovered that healing isn't about returning to who we were, but becoming who we're meant to be. Sometimes our greatest purpose emerges from our deepest pain, and sometimes the family we need finds us when we least expect it. Luna didn't just save Joe's life. She showed him that love creates new definitions of family that transcend every boundary we thought was permanent. Tell us in the comments, what unexpected Luna has appeared in your life during your later years? Have you found new purpose in caring for someone or something that needed protection? Share your stories of how love surprised you when you thought your caring days were over.